Yeah.
We're just talking about what it's like to feel something extraordinary, like that what some people call the sacred. And you were just talking about an experience on a mountain where you were sitting down looking, was it at the stars, and you could feel this something quite remarkable moving through you, like you described it as a warm energy, like an oil or something.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but my experience is different to that. It's very rare I feel anything like that.
Hmm.
I have had transcendental experiences meditating. So
Hmm.
I did a course for a couple of years, and involved meditating for a good couple of weeks solid. And I was terrible at it. I don't think I'm necessarily designed very well to meditate because I have a very active mind. So
Hmm.
I'm sort of on that ADHD spectrum. So there's
Hmm.
lots of my thoughts are very busy, and I'm a stimulation junkie. So I constantly need stimulation. So sitting down in the quiet is hard. So I was probably the worst in the class at it. But towards the end, I had a very profound experience. It was like this sense that time stopped,
Hmm.
and I felt almost like a pressure, as if time was pushing up against me, but I had completely become still, and I could feel
Hmm.
every atom, every particle in the air just go
Hmm.
completely, not just still, but solid. It felt dense,
Hmm.
like there was a weight to it.
Hmm.
And it blew my mind because I'd never up until that point experienced anything that had an altered state of consciousness.
Hmm.
So that experience for me was probably the first sort of flag in the ground to tell me that there seems to be something more to reality than meets the eye. For a lot of people, that's not something that they ever experience it, or ever will. But you seem to have quite a lot of these experiences. Would you say, like, is it something you have more access to?
I wouldn't say that this is something that's like a daily event, but it's something that at one point in my life, I suppose, got unlocked, and it was my early 20s, and one of the first deep and meaningful experiences of that was I was at MoMA in New York in the art museum looking at a display of works by Jackson Pollock, and I was standing in front of one of these enormous drip paintings where he was just splattering paint on the canvas, and hundreds of people packed into this room. Of course, it's a very popular exhibit, but the whole world dropped away, and it was just me standing in front of this painting, swallowed up in the painting, and then it was as though I was plugged into a socket of energy that was just coursing through my body, and I felt like somehow the experience of being somehow connecting with the energy of the artist. I don't know how else to put it. I had a similar experience in Jerusalem when I was visiting the old city, as a tourist really, but ended up following a group of people that were traversing the Stations of the Cross. One of them was dragging a cross along, and they were stopping at each station and saying prayers and burning incense and all of that. And I wouldn't think that that would be a place where I would experience the sacred. It's a little bit chaotic. It's people shoving into each other. But somehow I had this quite a profound experience similar to what I experienced standing in front of this Jackson Pollock painting,
Mm,
similar to
mm,
what I had experienced some years earlier on a hike to Mount Rainier, sitting on a rock and looking at the mountain, and those three very different experiences, are and then similarly in music, some music reliably triggers that experience.
mm.
The B minor mass of Bach, a certain moment of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony right before the choir comes in. Those experiences made me really think about what was happening. So what is this thing? And it led me on quite an interesting journey of reading through literature of mystics who've described these sorts of things. Is
Hmm.
this the same thing that the mystics were having?
Is
Is
it,
this the same sort
yeah,
of thing that
yeah,
people
like
have in meditative states
an
like you had?
ecstatic state and so on? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I also have tried meditation. Not as deeply and not as I should, but a few months ago I was on a meditation retreat, and like you, I think my mind is a little bit too active. It gets sidetracked very easily. I found that I loved the experience of meditating. I felt like I realized I could do it for hours on end, but what was happening was my mind was just exploring all sorts of interesting ideas, and so I
Yeah,
had to
that's
have a
right.
notepad
Yeah.
to take notes. And at one point, I was talking to the person who was running, my friend who was running this meditation retreat. And I said, "This is amazing. I'm getting all these insights, and I'm starting a diary on this." He said, "No." He said, "Stop." He said, "That's not what should be happening."
Yeah,
It should
yeah,
be an emptying out of ideas, which is a bit of a downer for me to hear that. But it's this thing that's to be had everywhere. That's the thing that seems to be. It's as though there's some dimension of the universe, which if one aligns oneself to it, then it unlocks a kind of, moving with the flow, which is quite profound. And it isn't going to be the same for everyone. It isn't something that unlocks knowledge specifically. It's not, oh, now I know something I didn't know before, unless it's a kind of greater intuition of the interconnectedness of things, of the sacredness of things. But what do we mean by sacred?
Well, exactly. It seems to be different things to different people, because if you speak to some different religions and different spiritual outlooks, everybody seems to have their own explanation of what it is, and it's in certain ways it's similar, in many ways it's very different. I used to go to a spiritualist church when I was in my 20s, so I had a good decade of, I guess it's more New Age kind of a modern take on older spiritual sort of traditions. So it was all about meditating. It was taking elements and aspects of Buddhism and Hinduism and paganism and Christianity and just creating this new, what do they call it? A syncretic religion, or a syncretic tradition. And I really enjoyed it. And when I was there, I remember I went there as a skeptic, because I wanted to see if there was something more to life than meets the eye. Because up to that point, I hadn't had any spiritual experiences. I used to meet people who'd said, "Oh, we see ghosts. We can see ghosts in the backyard of our house." And I used to be like, "Really?" Because I've never seen anything like that in my life, or any evidence of anything like that. So when I went to this spiritualist church, I had enough experiences, like seeing auras, having these. I had a good 2 or 3 transcendental sort of shifts in consciousness, where I just felt like I was in a different compartment of my mind that I didn't even know existed. And it took training and people to guide you there to find it. So I think for a lot of people, if they've never gone there and they've never experienced it and they've never explored it, they don't even know there's this wellspring of energy and experience within your own mind that you can access. But what is it? What do you think is the sacred?
So yeah, that's such an interesting question. I think of the sacred. How do you put in words something which is fundamentally a wordless experience? You have to reach for a metaphor, and a metaphor that I find helpful is the metaphor of verticality. We inhabit a world in which is defined by these three directions, forward, backward, right, left, up, down. And intrinsically, these directions are all equal to one another. I mean, if you're on the surface of the earth, then up, down is different from forward and backwards. But take the earth out of the picture, and you're just floating in outer space, and every direction is pretty much the same as every other direction. But the idea of the sacred to me is the idea that there is somehow embedded in the structure of reality what technically you would call a broken symmetry. There is one direction is different from another direction for some reason. And we can call that verticality. And that's helpful because already I think culturally we think of heaven as above and that sort of a thing. And so it feeds into our existing idea about the sacred. But this idea that there's a sort of a vertical axis that runs through creation, it's a very ancient idea common to many cultures. Karl Jaspers took this idea in his idea of the axial age, about historically a time when different cultures, more or less in a kind of synchrony over several centuries, all simultaneously evolved this idea of the axiality of the world, that there is this vertical component. And I think it's also helpful to think about that vertical component, which is obviously not a physical component, but it's a direction of travel of consciousness. It's the idea of the sacred to me is the idea that there is a direction of travel of consciousness which is aligned with some sort of intrinsic structure of the universe. And that direction of consciousness, I believe, is in the direction of expansion of consciousness. And expansion of consciousness is in turn aligned with so many of what we would call spiritual virtues: concern for one's neighbor, love for neighbor, concern for the poor and the downtrodden, outward orientation, an orientation towards service to one's fellow human beings.
Rather than a sort of consciousness going inward, being self-orientated,
It does
you're saying
both.
something
I mean,
more.
yes, it does both. I mean, you could sit, as I have, as many have, sit in a kind of meditative posture and go inward and have experiences of the sacred. And it's not to say that I think the direction of consciousness in the universe, this, the grain in the stone, if you will, a rock seems like this amorphous mass, but if there's a grain in the stone, you strike it and it sheaves off in a particular direction. I think it's that sort of a thing, that is both inward and outward. I mean, we have different languages to describe it. We have a sort of inner language of divine immanence, and we have also an outer language of divine transcendence. It's been the sacred has been located both within and without. But I think in this physical cosmos that we inhabit, I think the direction of the sacred is revealed partly in the cosmological record, partly in the fossil record, partly in the human record of civilizations. I think all of these records, the record of the physical universe, of life and biological evolution and history and historical evolution, all seems to me to be pointing in a similar direction. And that direction is simple things becoming more complex. And as they become more complex, they, as it were, unlock higher degrees of consciousness. I'm dancing around the word consciousness and not drilling in and say, well, what exactly, how exactly do I define consciousness? I suppose I'm defining it more by analogy.
Should we, is it worth touching on this now, the hard problem of consciousness, just to give people a reference of why we're speaking about this in a slightly sacred kind of way?
Well, I guess it's a bit of a byway, because I'm not sure I have any particular insight into the hard problem of consciousness, except that, it's now consciousness used to be one of those topics you couldn't really talk about as, say, a professional philosopher, but nowadays you can. Nowadays it's a very sexy topic and everyone's talking about it. People like David Chalmers.
I've noticed it's just taken off,
made it
hasn't
very
it, on
popular.
the internet?
I think there's an acknowledgement that consciousness is an interesting thing. It quite possibly cannot be explained simply as an epiphenomenon, simply as a biological add-on, which is a incidental outcome of the billion years of evolution of life on this planet, whose only function is to increase the ability of organisms to survive and reproduce. I think people like David Chalmers and others have successfully argued that there may be something else interesting going on here, because consciousness seems to be an irreducible feature of the world that can't be explained in all of its attributes by reference to complex matter as a substrate for it. And I agree with this. I do believe that consciousness is the grain in the stone. I think consciousness is the essence of that axis mundi, the essence of the directionality of the sacred in the world, that we can see on almost at least on this planet, trace its origins and its development particularly through the fossil record, through the gradual increasing of brain size, which is correlated with higher states of and greater states of consciousness, and which I don't believe is confined to human beings. Obviously, other creatures possess it to varying degrees. This is not a binary kind of thing that you can confine this this sacred quality to one species over others. But I think that the directionality, though, of this consciousness and the directionality of sacred ultimately is the direction of wider and wider circles of human unity, at least in this historical time period. That the direction of consciousness in the immediate future is one in which people overcome the tribalisms of various kinds, which seem to be an indelible feature of the human psyche, of human conception of identity, whether it be of nationality or race or religion. All of these are, in the end, limited ways of conceiving of human identity, which I believe in the context of the directionality of the sacred ultimately have to give way to a still larger conception of our identity as conscious beings, which I think brings us to the kind of why this is relevant to the moment. Why we can talk about the sacred at any time period, and how it's been manifested in different ways, but we can also look at why we need to have the sacred today, why it's important to talk about it today in light of what's going on in the
world. We're living in a very secular world. We've got rationalism, individualism, capitalism. It's very much focused on the material world. It's very much focused on the individual trying to do the best they can and to live a fulfilling life. But it's not a very, when I was a kid growing up, we were brought up in it was a Christian school. We had to sing hymns, and we had to have parables from the Bible. And I remember finding it quite boring at times when I was a kid, thinking, God, can't we tell Greek myths instead of all these sort of biblical scriptures? But it was grounding something spiritual in us. But I've noticed as I was getting older that it was being taught in the schools less and less, and that secularism was on the rise. In the UK, I don't know what it's like in Oregon, but in the UK, I just noticed that there's this downward trajectory that religion is slowly becoming a softer cultural phenomenon rather than something that we try to impart principles about what it is to live a sacred life, a spiritual life, and so on.
Arguably, we're in the midst of a slow motion collapse of the idea of the sacred as a living presence in society, really accelerated from the time of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment.
Which
gave us an alternative way of navigating the world, in which mind is very much there. Descartes was there at the beginning, trying to carve out a place for mind and matter as separate substances. But then later Enlightenment thinkers could dispense with it entirely and say, well, it's all just matter. But that idea had such power and allowed us to unlock so many of the secrets of creation, allowed us to improve human life in so many dimensions through the development of science and technology, that it became easy to forget that from the beginning, the scientific method that allows us to subdue nature so well and to bend it towards our purposes, that it was a epistemological assumption to start with, to say, well, let's just act as though everything can be quantified. Let's confine our conversation to things which can be objectively observed, quantified, and let's proceed on that basis, and look what the result is.
They've been able to plumb right down to the atom.
Yeah.
They've been able to get telescopes to look right out into space.
Both directions.
There's energy we wouldn't even have known about, like electromagnetic energy and gamma rays. So we've literally
amazing things.
I would say materialistically, we have done an incredible job and seen things that would blow the minds of our ancestors, to think that it's like, what is this gravity you speak of? We understand the mathematics of it and everything. But this is where it gets interesting. This is a question I've got for you, because you're a cosmologist as well, aren't you, Stephen? So you've got a deep understanding of how the cosmos works. So there are elements where, as the scientists from the Enlightenment up until now have been, as I said, plumbing into the atom and gazing out into space, they've come across things that are seemingly unknowable, indefinable, and it seems to fall away from what we can measure, what we can know, and goes into a realm of, well, we just don't know. And that would be what came before the Big Bang, what caused the Big Bang, what is inside black holes, what is dark energy, what is dark matter. When in science you come to these areas, a lot of scientists will say we just don't know at the moment, and that's a good position to be. We don't have to pour anything into it like spirit or anything. We just stay where we are. But they are really stuck, aren't they? This is something that seems to go beyond materialism and just enters some kind of realm of the absolute mysterious unknown. And that's where our ancestors used to look at. They'd always look for the mysterious and say, we need to try and understand this. And they would use their minds. They would use the very thing that we've just been speaking about, their conscious minds, to try and think, right, this is something we don't know about. So let's just try and philosophize our way to an answer. Like, what created all of this? And they philosophized their way to some kind of supreme being or some kind of almighty power. And but that's what they would do when they get to mysterious. Now, scientists do something interesting. They tend to stop and go, we're going to keep looking, but whilst we don't know, we don't know. But I would put to them, maybe it's somewhere they can never go to. Maybe it's the, what's that famous theorem? Gödel's incompleteness theorem?
Yeah.
This idea that it seems to be something outside of our system, that every time we try to bring our conscious observing intelligence to it, it just seems to go, nope, you're not going to know the answer. You cannot know what's inside a black hole. You cannot know what's before the Big Bang. You cannot know what dark matter and dark energy is. It's just outside the system. You might be seeing a shadow of it, perhaps, but it's the model itself that we are locked into. Some people might call it a simulation. Some people might call it the material universe. But it seems to be that outside of this, if there is such a thing, it's unreachable at this moment. It seems to be just we're locked out of it. So what's your thoughts on that? Do you think that means that there is something sacred about these cosmological features I've just mentioned, because they do the same thing as the hard problem of consciousness, in that your mind cannot seem to understand how it works? We've studied neuropsychology and neuroscience. We've looked at all the different fibers and chain molecules in the brain. We've carved it into different portions and sizes. We've looked at it in detail, and we have absolutely no idea how it's creating a conscious experience that is photorealistic and has perfect photo fidelity, perfect stereophonic sound. Everything is just brilliant. And they're looking at this grey matter and they're going, how? It doesn't. We just don't know. So it seems to be that for some strange reason, when we try to understand consciousness just goes, nope, you're not allowed in. The gates are closed. What's your thoughts on that?
So many different topics that you just introduced. I could go in 10 different directions. But one note of caution, I suppose I would sound, is there has always been the temptation because there's always been a boundary of our understanding. That boundary is always expanding as we explore more and more of our world and understand more and more of it. But there's always a region of the unknown beyond the sphere of our understanding.
Yes, and every time we answer some of it, we fill a bit of the gap in, and then another gap appears.
Yes. You know where I'm going. There's always been a temptation to fill that gap with the thing that we want to fill it with, which is God, the sacred, something very comforting to us, something that affirms us, the God of the gaps. But the history of the God of the gaps is a sad one if you're the God of the gaps, because you keep getting squeezed out of, as the spaces get filled in, the space for that kind of God to work its magic becomes smaller and smaller. We understand lightning now as electromagnetic phenomenon, not as Zeus throwing his thunderbolts, and on it goes. And so I think we should always be profoundly skeptical. I like how Carl Sagan put it about the scientific mindset, which has to hold in a kind of dynamic tension two different opposing tendencies. One is we should remain very radically open to radical new ideas about how the universe might be. On the other hand, we should also be radically skeptical about these ideas and to relentlessly test them
Yes.
to show
Yes.
that they're correct, especially when it comes to regions where human bias can enter. And those areas where human bias can enter are particularly those areas which dwell on these kinds of existential questions of what is the ultimate goal, what is the ultimate origin of things, what is the ultimate goal of things. That being said, I'm perfectly willing and happy to go into all sorts of metaphysical speculation about questions of origins and endings and so forth. And I think we have some really cool stuff we can talk about, but not as scientific theories, more as plausible ways of understanding the universe, recognizing that the facts that we have about the universe underdetermine the space of possible theories. We have a few. John Wheeler put it very, very nicely. He said it's like the data that we have are like these fence posts. They're planted here and there. In between is the theories that we fill it in with. But really, the facts that we have are just a very small set of solid bits of evidence that we have. And there are a lot of different ways that we can take that evidence and blow it into different interesting theories. And I think nowhere is this more the case in theories of cosmological theories about origins. We can take the facts of the Big Bang, the fact of there being an event that happened approximately 14 billion years ago, from which the known universe emerges in a state that was initially very hot and very dense, and out of which cooled and crystallized, as it were, balls of hot gases and so forth that ends up with stars and planets and galaxies. That's like the fence post. We know that that's the case. Where you can sort of take your mind and imagine, well, what happened before the Big Bang? Are there other Big Bangs? It gets really interesting, really kind of sexy, and lots of people theorize about it. Lots of scientists write papers about it, but we have to keep some sort of, I think, cool distance from it and realize that we're talking about theories that don't necessarily have solid evidence to validate them at this time, but that we can validate them perhaps by other sorts of means. And this is where I think when we talk about the sacred versus the secular, I think we can take a similar sort of scientific mindset of skeptical scrutiny about both of these areas of human thought. And we can also take a sort of mindset of trying to validate it in a scientific way. But the way you validate a scientific theory, by making quantitative measurements, quantifying your uncertainties, sharing the results, and so forth, is slightly different than how do you validate an idea of the sacred. And I think the way you validate ideas of the sacred is more, how does it apply in the world? What does it produce in the world? Does it produce a benefit to humanity or not? So that's, I guess, just a kind of framing idea, and it's gone a little bit far.
Just to give that a little bit of context, I did an article recently talking about the people who believe in religion and people who don't. And people who believed in religion had a higher longevity, so they lived longer. They tended to be happier. They tended to have more wholesome relationships. This is studies done across the world, so they're quite consistent. So those who do seem to have a belief, it does seem to enrich their lives, but it does require faith, which means that they believe there's something sacred there, and they orientate their lives around it, and they build that into their personal daily experience and how they relate to the outside world. Whereas other people who are secular, myself, I've been secular for 2 decades. I'm now flirting with other ideas, but that's not there. There's an absence of that. So it's more about, how do I live a fulfilling life, and how do I make sure my family's happy? But there seems to be people die earlier. They aren't as healthy. Their relationships aren't as strong. So there's an interesting correlation. And I'm not saying that to put down secularism. It's just an observation that's been measured. Yeah. So when we're looking at the sacred and we're saying what relevance does it have, we already can see enough evidence to say at the very least It seems to be giving people a sense of meaning, purpose, and that seems to enrich their lives and can add literally years onto their life. So that's just one little thing which is worth mentioning.
Yeah, or not so little thing. Although others would caution, they say, don't believe in that which makes you feel good. You hear that all the time from a scientific mindset, and I think there's a very good reason to be skeptical of taking as true the things which make us feel good, because those have a checkered history. Sometimes the things which make us feel good may not make our neighbor feel good, or maybe the people who live on the other side of the world feel good. I'm referring to the fact that so many of our sacred narratives have embedded in them a tribalism, which really is very difficult to remove, and which ultimately puts you as an individual, as a culture, as a faith community, as essentially opposed to those others over there somewhere. And I think that's one aspect of the narratives that we have today, the sacred narratives that we have today, which I think somehow has to be transcended, because it's now become an existential problem for humanity. We could go along with narratives which center the individual or center the tribe, as long as there was effectively an infinite amount of resources, infinite amount of land to expand into. We know that hasn't been the case over already for centuries, and that a lot of expansion has been taking place into other people's land and into other people's cultures. But what we found just in the past couple of decades is we've actually hit, in a way, the physical boundaries of our planet in a way that we hadn't before. I'm talking about the fact that we're now starting to see a collective effect of human behavior on our environment, which, if it continues unchecked, is ultimately going to lead to our own destruction. That requires a level of coherent action on the part of humanity, a level of collective action that we haven't been able to attain up until this point, because our identities are still fundamentally situated at the level of language groups, races, religions, nationalities, and so forth, all of which we can say had their place in earlier stages of human evolution and sort of getting humanity to where it is. But these various boundaries have to be transcended, I think, going into the future. And I think that leads us directly to this question of the sacred, and how the sacred is, the ideas of the sacred and human identities which are centered around the sacred. If we follow past models of how these have been manifested in the world, may not just not solve the problem, but it may lead us farther away from the solution. In other words, retreating into faith traditions of the past that have tribalism too far embedded into them will keep us from making the kind of movement we need to make into the future, which is, I think, an idea of the sacred which somehow transcends the boundaries between one religion and another, and that also somehow transcends the boundary, this artificial divide which exists between our idea of the sacred and the secular. I think both of these chasms need to be bridged.
Yeah, I did it again. This is based on a post I did relatively recently. I was talking about the first man and woman mytheme. So Adam and Eve is one most people are familiar with. You've got Ask and Embla in Norse mythology. Nuwa, this Chinese goddess, made the first humans out of clay on the Yellow River. That mytheme travelled across the whole world, but it had to have originated somewhere. And talking to John White, we reckon it was the Neolithic, the agricultural era, because around about that time we started tilling the fields, and we started to literally manipulate the earth, and even clay pottery appears at that time. So we are molding the earth to create crops and fields, and we're literally molding it to create pots and figurines. And then suddenly this story appears where humans are made of clay. And when it first appeared, I think that mytheme was trying to tell everybody, look, we're living together in villages and towns and early proto-cities like Catalhoyuk. These are very early towns, and we've all got to get together. We've all got to work together, and we've all got to live together. And I'm sure there was probably a lot of difficulty in bringing all these tribes together. So the idea of saying we're all descended from the same people. We're all of the same stock from this first man, first woman. So when you get tribes from certain valleys and hills and mountains and you bring them all together, this story was a uniting story, trying to bring them together, saying, you may not be somebody I know directly, but we are related. We are from the same family. Spiritually speaking, this story is trying to unite us. So it had a uniting power. And you find that as Catalhoyuk and Jericho and other early towns were popping up around the Near East, there doesn't seem to be any sign of warfare and fighting and cracked skulls. It seems to be a relatively quiet time. So that myth would have played a good part, I would like to think, in doing that. But then, as humanity was growing tribes in other regions, say in Turkey and down in Africa and Egypt, they started coming into conflict all of a sudden, because that story had morphed and changed, and now this Egyptian colony, no, they were the ones the first humans. I don't know who these people are from Jericho, and then people from Jericho would say, no, we're for the first humans. I don't know what these Europeans are talking about. But they're all riffing off this same early myth theme, but it traveled away from them, and they didn't realize it was going off and mutating and going into other tribes and other cultures. And as they grew over thousands of years and started to meet each other, that was no longer serving. It didn't seem to have that binding quality. So it suddenly was, this is my story, your story's wrong, our story's right. And as you say, this tribalism took off, and it's we've been dealing with that ever since, really, haven't we?
Yes. And another thing we can't avoid in talking about this is going back to the cosmological picture. You can't look at a picture of, say, a galaxy cluster from the James Webb Telescope and not realize just how big the universe is, and how big the universe is. Every pixel on those on those photographic images is its own galaxy, containing hundreds of billions of stars, untold number of planets, untold amount of life on planets and moons in those distant galaxies, and that's just in one pixel. And how can we possibly take any of the narratives that have come down to us, the historical narratives, the sacred narratives that have motivated human behavior up until this time? How can we possibly take any of those in any sense as factual narratives? I think the existence of modern cosmology, I think, blows up these narratives in a very fundamental way. It shows them to be too small for the universe as it really is. And I think it forces us to think about, however we're going to think about the sacred in the future, however that's going to, as I believe it will, continue to be a fundamental motivating factor in human behavior going into the future. Whatever shape religion takes, in other words, to stop dancing around the word, has to somehow take into account both the physical size of the universe and the physical age of the universe, both of which so exceed this little 5,000 year chunk of human history where we have written records, and where we've sort of taken these written records of and the religions that have appeared during this time, and we try to extrapolate beyond those boundaries into this infinite void of space and time. And I don't think the mapping works. I think we have to find other ways of thinking about the sacred, which are, to start with, less anthropomorphic. And I think it's easy to poo-poo anthropomorphism. It's easy to sort of make fun of Thor and Zeus and all of those gods as, oh, clearly these are childish, products of our childish past, and we can transcend those. But how much less childish is the monotheism of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition? We're still fundamentally making out the supreme being after our own image, and then flipping the narrative and saying we're made in the image of that, in the image of that being. We're clearly, our idea of religion is exactly what we would expect it to be, given that we are, primates that have descended from, that were swinging from trees a million years ago. And
I love how religion and mythology, they are like brother and sister, they're twins. And when you get an update in history, so in, say, prehistoric times, you had animism, and the myths of that time were focused around hunting, just the things that we did in general life. Maybe there were folk tales about wolves and so on that are still with us today. But then there'd be an update and somebody'd go, I've been thinking about this universe, and I think I just thought there was a living energy in it. But now I'm starting to think that the clouds and the storm are actual force, an actual entity. And I think that the sea is an entity in its own right. So they started to personify it, and there was an update, and all of a sudden the myths changed, and they were all new ones appeared, or old ones are updated, and it's like, so now we're at another level of understanding, and more insights were made. One of my favorite ones is when creation stories used to be about land being created, and a diving bird or a boar would jump into the sea and pull up some mud and spread it across the surface of the land, and that's how land was created. But as our ancestors were, still in the prehistoric to the Neolithic to the Bronze Age, they were thinking hard about how all this was created. So you'd get these updates. It might have been a Bronze Age invention, but they started to think about the beginning of the cosmos, not as a bird getting land, but as nothing. There's nothing there. There's void, there's darkness, there's chaos and nothingness. And that was a new update that wasn't there in the sort of mythical record up until maybe the Neolithic or the Bronze Age. And what blows me away is when you look at all of the different stories and all the variations as each tribe gets that story and they do their own spin on it. They were talking about what I can only describe as the Big Bang. So they would talk about an egg or a tiny grain of sand or a tiny little hill, and expanding and expanding and expanding outwards. And then as it suddenly the egg cracks open, or the hill suddenly pushes out of the waters, or the god unfurls. Once that happens, they then start to get to the creating of the cosmos, and they take in some cases they use their own body to create the matter, and they use their breath to create the heavens. Or there might be other beings that kill this cosmic man, and they use his body to form the firmament and the stars, and the blood then becomes the rivers and so on. Or they just say the egg itself cracks open and there's a god inside, and it uses the yolk to create the matter, and it uses its breath to create the spirit. But ultimately, they talk about nothingness, and from that nothingness, a particle expanding, and then from that, everything that we know here today, it came from that egg or that particle or that hill.
Yeah.
And so metaphorically, they were on the button, but practically and literally, it was a story. It was deeply misunderstanding how all this began. But metaphorically, they had it, and that blows my mind. I always think about how they didn't have telescopes, they didn't have microscopes, they didn't have any of the technical devices we have today. Just imagination, rationalization, and just sitting down and thinking by a campfire, and they were able to discern these things. So and I suspect when these stories appeared, it was the Einstein of their time. It would have been an Einstein or an Oppenheimer or somebody just really thinking deeply and just suddenly unlocking something. They were getting something. So I agree with you that the myths today, Joseph Campbell said this in one of his last books, The Inner Reaches of Outer Space. He said, we're now living in an age of science, technological breakthroughs, new cultural phenomenon. We've got new ideologies. So the myths seem to be irrelevant. And the idea of the sacred doesn't necessarily hold much stock today.
Yes.
And yet we're watching, as secularism is pushing forwards and the Enlightenment is taking root, and we're seeing religion on a decline, especially in the West. It's still doing very well in the East, but in the West, it is on a slow decline. But as we're seeing this, we're seeing, how did John Vervaeke put it? He calls it the meaning crisis, where there just seems to be a lack of purpose and meaning for people. They're less fulfilled. Anxiety's on the rise. Depression's on the rise. People feel hopeless. They feel lost. There's anarchy rising because people want to bring the system down, saying it doesn't work for everybody. And we're seeing, I think it's fair to say there seems to be a social breakdown. There seems to be the contract that we all look after each other and take care of each other, which was very much in the domain of religion. That just seems to be slowly eroding. And so this is why I think mythology does need an update, because people don't realize how it used to hold us together, how unifying it was, how powerful it was. Everybody would have those stories when they were kids and grow older, and they would all be connected by these stories, and they gave you a sense of, this is who I am in the cosmos, this is my place, this is my purpose here. I'm here to be a caregiver, or I'm here to be an engineer, or I'm here to be a warrior or a king, whatever that is. You could feel your purpose was there, divined by the stars. And to bring something like that back today is a big ask for people, because science has just given us so much. You just think, what did myth ever give us compared to science? But I think they don't realize it gave
what
us
did the
more than they
Romans
realized.
ever give to us besides the aqueducts and
mythology gave us purpose, just like religion.
Exactly.
They gave us purpose. So that's what we're lacking. And so Joseph Campbell said, which is what I'd like to discuss with you a bit today, we need a new myth of our time that makes relevant again the old stories, which is possible. As I said, the Big Bang, we talk about, science has done so much for us, we now understand about the Big Bang. They understood on some metaphorical, meaningful level. They understood that. They divined that. In fact, I'd go as far as saying, if it wasn't for those insights they made in myth and religion, science would not have had a bedrock to build upon. So they were the forebearers. So I think there's a lot we really should look back and take a strong look and say, have we thrown the baby out with the bathwater?